Well, this is Dave Gaddis, and today is March 24th, 2015, and today we're interviewing Robin McCaffrey here at his offices in Dallas. So welcome, Robin.
Thank you.
Why don't we start at the beginning and tell us when and where you were born?
Baltimore, Maryland.
Okay, and why? What did your folks do that you were in Baltimore?
Well, my family for several generations in Maryland are attorneys. So my father was an attorney there, and so my brother is an attorney as a result. And I guess for reasons I can't fully understand, I chose not to be an attorney and instead pursue something else.
Okay, did you stay in Baltimore your entire childhood?
No, I left when I went to college. So I came down to, got my undergraduate at Texas A&M in architecture.
Okay.
And so I came to Texas A&M because my school guidance counselor said that was a good architecture school at that time, high school guidance counselor. So I came down, and it was a very beneficial experience, but it's where I got introduced to planning, to architecture.
Why did you go into architecture?
Well, I liked spatial problems, you know, and I liked construction, and I liked the tangibility of it and the artisan nature of it, right? And when I came to school, indeed that was a big part of it, but to me I became more influenced by or impressed with the theoretical nature of it, the historical continuity of it, working within a tradition, working as an opportunity to extend a body of thought, perhaps turn a page for my fellow professionals. And that became an idea that I had, that something I really wanted to do.
Okay.
So.
Do you recall any of the professors at A&M that stood out in your career?
Yes, and the most profound experience of anyone was the dean of the School of Architecture, Ed Romanick, who's now deceased, but he was a colorful and powerful personality. As you can imagine, A&M back in that day was, this is the mid-60s, you know, the height of the Vietnam War, and Ed Romanick had a architecture school there that was very boisterous and flamboyant, and so it was like Summerhill in a way, you know, as a school experiment. It was an architecture experiment, and we had a lot of people come, like Ralph Rapson from Minnesota, famous architects came because Romanick was from Chicago, and he had some ongoing dialogue with architects around the country. So A&M was a sort of crossroads of people going to the West Coast or East Coast. They come to A&M. And Romanick and I hit it off, and he said to me one day, he said, you know, McCaffrey, he always called me McCaffrey, he says, you seem like you're just kind of awfully pensive these days. What's wrong with you, you know? Or as in Chicago, he'd say, what's wrong with use? That's what he would say. And so I said, well, I don't know, Dean. I said, you know, this architecture thing is, I'm seeing it differently these days. He says, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you come down to my office, put together something that you think Rob McCaffrey wants to do with architecture, and bring it down and let me look at it. And if it's worth your while, I'll let you do it. I said, well, so I went back to my room, and the previous summer I had taken one of your romantic hitchhiking trips throughout Europe, and spent quite a bit of time in Ireland, where I worked at a mission in Ireland because I ran out of money halfway, and so they gave me room and board, and I helped build a dormitory on a 17th century structure in Ireland with the mission group. But I wanted to go back to Ireland to relive that experience. It was both spiritual and it was emotional for me to learn that. So I came up with an idea that what I wanted to study was the extent to which cities as a universal experience, while they may vary from Florence to Paris, nonetheless, all cities serve the same economic purposes, so there is a universality to that. So to what extent does a city itself create and shape human behavior that is uniquely that city? And I thought, you know, if I did that in like New York, where I have Russian and Hungarian and Polish immigrants all interchanging in some sort of ideological melding pot, I would never be able to tease out those things that are truly a result of the physical framework of city, right? So I said, Ireland, because it's homogeneous. It's homogeneous in terms of cultural identity. Everybody's Catholic, everybody's related to some extent, pretty much, and you have rural Irish people, and you have first-generation urbanites, and you have multi-generation urbanites, all sort of an extension of one to the other. So there was this sort of homogeneous sort of ideology there that make the patterns be primarily response to physical fabric. Anyway, that's what I pitched to Romney. He thought it was a great idea. And he said, so what do you need? So I outlined the things that I would need to do this, and he made it possible. And I went off and I spent a year in Ireland researching this issue, which is my introduction to planning. And while there I worked, because my work was intersecting with a number of people, what was called Ann Forrest for Brother, which is the United Nations Planning Agency, then working on Shannon. And so I got to test some of these theories in that Newtown experiment. And so for a young 20-year-old, that was quite a profound experience, you could imagine. And I came back never to be the same again. And so I proceeded into planning as my chosen profession.
Okay. A&M in the mid-'60s, was that when, were you a member of the Corps, or was that when
I was not a member of the Corps. I didn't even know about the Corps. So I applied to A&M, and I didn't know that it had a military tradition. I didn't know it had any of that stuff. And so, I got a book at the library, and I read all this stuff, like, the bonfire and the Corps and the UT and the boots and everything. I said, wow, is this like a military school? So I called the registration office. I said, is that a military academy down there? And he said, well, no, we just have a very strong ROTC program. But this is the first year, it's optional. And I said, well, I'm just not ready to go to the military academy. I could be on that optional list. That was about 2% of the student population then. So we were sort of that group that was not in the Corps, but that was part of the total experience.
Okay. Before we get too far away from it, I noticed that you had Penn State down. Was that before A&M, or
the what?
The Penn State agriculture?
Well, no. The Penn State was when I guess the romantic aspect of one's personality. While I was at the city of Dallas with Wei Ming Lu, working on the urban design program here, that was in the 70s. Of course, everybody's an alternative lifestyle person when they're in the 70s. You have to have been there to realize that's the case. That my wife and I thought we might want to sort of try our hand at farming. So I got this correspondence diploma from Penn State, and then I thought dairy science, the dairyman was what I wanted to be, because of the management options it provided. You have basically you're managing the amount of protein that a cow eats, and it turns into milk, and there's a scientific aspect to it. It's not like, will it rain tomorrow, sort of agriculture. And it was really a business you could manage. And so we bought a dairy farm in Wisconsin once I got that diploma, and we had it for several years. And what's interesting about agriculture is that you have two choices. You're a sod buster, or you're an agribusinessman. There's no middle ground, which is what the alternative lifestyle course sought. My wife was a traveling art teacher for all the schools in Trempealeau County, and then I would work the farm, and so it was our vision of the lifestyle we wanted to have. But we did that for a couple of years and realized we didn't want to be agribusinessmen, and the pressure to be that was perhaps more of a rat race than anything you could possibly imagine. So we ended up selling the farm.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to your graduated A&M with an architecture degree.
Graduated A&M with an architecture degree, came to Dallas, and which was, again, a very fortunate experience, not unlike the spiritual experience I had in Ireland. Came to Dallas, and at that time the goals for Dallas was just including very strong mayor, Eric Johnson, former CEO of Texas Instruments, and then we had 5 at-large elected councilmen. So we had a the business community of Dallas was very much involved in the leadership of Dallas. And they had produced this wonderful document called Goals for Dallas, out of which came the airport, the West End Historic District, the Trinity Project, and you name it. Much of what makes Dallas today came from the Goals for Dallas program and the leadership that they imposed. Well, being young and totally unqualified for any job I might take at the city, it was said, we need someone to sort of be the Goals for Dallas guy here, you take that job, okay? So I was thrown into a position way beyond my experience at the time, but it was very interesting, and clearly we needed to, urban design was a major call for the Goals for Dallas, and it was more than just macro architecture, which is what I think people see urban design as being some sort of big streetscape project, The kind of urban design the Goals for Dallas seemed to suggest was something where there was a design consciousness within the decision processes of governance, which is a different problem. Instead of the project being physical and the client being singular, the client was multiple and the project was programmatic. And that's actually a harder design to affect, right? So a select committee to sort of advise getting that program underway had an opportunity to invite Wei Ming Lu to come to Texas from Minneapolis, where he had some good success with Nicollet Mall and the urban design achievements that Minneapolis had attained. And Wei Ming came down, and so Wei Ming, myself, and a couple other people were the core urban design group at the outset, charged with a big problem and a big license to make design happen in that really unexplored way. And the way you do that is, in order to affect and influence the decision processes of governance, one has to have advocacy, constituency, and regulation. And so those become the design sort of milieu. So we built alliances and built like the historic groups and the environmental groups and other groups came, organized. SOS, Save Open Space, was Outgrowth Urban Design Program. The Preservation Dallas today, then the Swiss Avenue Historic Preservation League, was an outgrowth of the Urban Design Program. And so we began, and the Urban Design Task Force, outgrowth the Urban Design Program. And so we began to build these sort of voices in the community to advocate for design, to give the political element the underpinnings that it needed to make those kind of decisions. And then we wrote the preservation ordinance, the site ordinance, the escarpment ordinance, the Turtle Creek design ordinance, and out of the preservation ordinance came Swiss Avenue, the West End, Fair Park designation, South Boulevard, Park Row. And so basically, historic preservation became a major vehicle for transformative planning. It wasn't about monument preservation or becoming a monument. It was about creating investment environments that would trigger change in the city. So for those of us who are old enough to remember, about 75, there was a huge wave of inflation that swept across the United States, hit Dallas. Real estate values jumped from a $20,000 house in 75, by 1980 was worth $150,000. So there was this moment in which the wave would hit. And when it did that, then everybody, basically in the context of that kind of change, is at some level or not a speculator, okay? So how can we give direction to that market? How can we do that? Well, we went in, one of the things that you need, if you need 3 environments for investment, you need stability, promise of return, and mitigation of risk. You need those 3 things on the table. So preservation of Swiss Avenue would create stability for that market to invest in. Along with that, we talked to the local bank, the Swiss Avenue Bank, about overcoming redlining and committing mortgage financing to those transactions, which they did. And then mitigation of risk came in the form of other things, like when Dave Fox did Bryant Place, there was a buyback agreement on the land underlying. So when the wave hit, the conditions were set, and the renaissance of East Dallas took place. I mean, that led to Munger Place, and the State Thomas Historic District was sort of became the Plymouth Rock on which Uptown stood as it marched out beyond the freeway. And so the West End became the first step to the diversification of a 9-to-5 office-dominant downtown core to bring in residential to downtown. And so urban design, through that idea of influencing the decision processes, and this way through preservation, set in motion a number of dynamics that today we're just now getting the benefits of, almost 40 years later. But it's transformed downtown, and it's so shifted the value gradients that the city once had that now we have all of Uptown building at, Class A rates, $1 million condos, that sort of thing. So when we came, I remember when Harry Parker, then the director of the museum, Wayman and I walked the Arts District. There was no Florida Street. There was a street. There were 3-story walk-ups with apartments in it, but with Trammell Crow's investment and the art and the museum's investment to build that tower in a place that was it was the farmers market area of the past, this end of downtown. But we could see it happening, and if it became sort of the Arts District. So the Arts District plan was an outgrowth of the urban design program. So it's left an indelible print on the face of the city, but more importantly, the Goals for Dallas left that print because it was a reflection of that leadership and that movement. So it was a rare opportunity. It gave us a national exposure, for a young guy like me, a chance to sort of write articles and things I want to be a part of and make presentations and speeches, and allowed me to combine design with planning in a way that I think was truly unique.
So how long did you stay at Dallas?
So that lasted from 70 to 76. There was this window of opportunity. Most things come and go. So opportunities come and go, and the politics changed as we moved toward a different political structure from our at-large districts. The whole political accountabilities became different. So my wife and I, who was also with the city and also a planner, we decided, well, if we're going to pursue this planning stuff really seriously, we were actually pretty serious by then anyway, we need to go back and get planning credentials. So we applied to MIT and a couple other schools, got accepted, and both of us together, so we went to MIT together, and actually welcomed to the program because of what we had done in Dallas was nationally being looked at as a success, and got a chance to continue some of that thinking at MIT. And so we were there for the duration of that program. And what's interesting, the story with MIT, as you could imagine, is a very mathematical, statistical, quantitative place. My wife and I are not those kind of people. We lead to more to sort of heuristic solutions to problems than sort of modeling them. But it was, given the stuff from Ireland and even the stuff here, this whole idea of the influence of fabric of place upon one's actions and how they respond to it, to me was powerful. And there was, at that time, there was J.B. Jackson and Yves Fouton and others were talking about topophilia and talking about, sort of cultural landscapes, that sort of thing. So we pitched an idea to the leadership at MIT saying we'd like to go to New Mexico, and where the space between Santa Fe and Taos is actually what's called a geologic graben. It's been uplifted from, if you come from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, you drive up that big hill. So this sort of geologic phenomena has isolated this universe, which the Indians in Long Rio Grande River hold as a sacred universe. Truchas Peak and Redondo Peak are sacred termini of their world, and that sort of thing. And so, here's a chance, because in there you have Hispanic, Anglo, and Indian inhabitants over 1,000 years or more. And if there are commonalities to the way the settlements are done, then the only way to explain those, being independent of time, technology, and culture, would be through the landscape relationships that they ascribe to and attain. We saw these letters from King Philip of Spain at MIT where the Hispanic colonials were writing, like, why don't these guys build according to the laws of the Indies? They have these eccentric settlements. We said, proof. And so MIT let us go. And we spent almost a year out there. And like anything, you say, how do I get into this problem? And why did I propose something so grand and get myself out here? But as you look at it, you say, okay, if I'm a mouse and I'm a human, I want to make a deduction about cancer from mouse to human. I can do that because both of them have lungs. They have a similar anatomy. So we got to sort of get our arms around some sort of anatomical view of settlement that allows us to sort of collate the different cultures. And so we scratched our heads on that. And we said, basically, the Indian perception of limits is defined by a sacred universe, the sacred peaks, the sacred cliffs, these sort of variations of sacredness that come into their settlement. The Hispanics were defined by drainage patterns because irrigated agriculture and where they built and that sort of thing. And the Anglos are defined by legalism, And so if we could create a mapping system that sort of have these sort of rings of consciousness on it, we ended up calling it sacred circles mapping. And we could then map the settlements, putting the features of settlement on the various sacred rings. Then we could overlay those settlements. Then we have a unifying view of place, overlay them and see what the differences are that transcend time, technology, and culture. We did that. We came up with like 65 or 70 things that could only be explained by different kinds of landscape response. And we went back to MIT and pitched that. Of course, we had some skeptics because it had no mathematical modeling, it had no predictive statistics. I couldn't say with a lambda test that it was 3%, a margin of error, that sort of thing. And so there was that group. And fortunately, on our thesis committee, we had then the executive director of the Cooper Hewitt Architecture Museum was on our thesis committee, very much a visionary. And he was very helpful in sort of saying that we need to really allow this to unfold because there's something here that is important given what other people are finding. And so we did that, and it became pretty successful. We ended up giving a presentation on that to the Rocky Mountain AIA conference and other places. And that was quite alarming. So I came away from MIT with that. That was my accomplishment there.
And who was your thesis advisor at MIT?
It was Dick Oliver, Richard Oliver.
Okay.
And he was then, he's since died, but he was then the director of the Cooper Hewitt in New York.
Okay. So you now have a master's degree. Where did you go from there?
So I came back to town, and my wife got a job teaching architecture at the first and second year design at UT. Okay. And I was still looking for a job, and I got to go down to San Antonio to be a principal planner. And again, it was a very fortuitous time because at that moment we were looking at doing a comp plan based on the limits of the Edwards Aquifer to support development, looking at extending the Riverwalk to creating River Plaza to make use of the white elephant of Hemisphere. What do we do with that? How do we energize it? And the west side of San Antonio, the Hispanic component of the city, had become very, very well organized and very articulate. And so the COP, Citizens Organized for Public Service, was definitely a force to be brought into the planning process. And what's interesting about advocacy that I've learned from my previous experience, that once you create avenues for advocacy, it's difficult to sustain vision because advocacy seeks to appropriate the opportunity in equal shares. So equity becomes a dominant outcome of advocacy, right? And that's certainly the case with COP. So we created a neighborhood planning program infrastructure that tried to allow that input to aggregate toward thematic ideas so that you could get differentiations in an environment which sought to sort of slice the pie equally. Sometimes you want more investment here so that everybody benefits to a larger extent. But that kind of outcome takes structure to do. It takes, the points of consensus may not be the final product. The points of consensus are the things that determine the final product. And that's where you need structure to pull that off. And so the program became an opportunity to sort of take a wonderful moment in time, which was the sort of very articulate voice of this group. And Henry Cisneros, also a graduate of my tree, and then we knew each other in Boston, was down at the same time, and so a lot of what I understood about that, I feel like I learned through him and other people that were gracious enough to give insight into that. Anyway, so again, three big things. It's like being in the right place at the right time. Again, without any qualification to do that whatsoever. He just thrown in the situation.
Now, is this when Cisneros was mayor, or was he just on?
No, at that time he was still in the infancy of his political career, being groomed to be Henry B. Gonzalez's follower or replacement. He later ended up becoming mayor. I got hired away from San Antonio very shortly to being there. I was there for a couple years, and then I was hired away by a development partnership in Dallas, which was the Caruth family is a big family here in Dallas that owned the property around North Park, much of North Dallas. Ultimately, the Bass family in Fort Worth was part of the partnership, and Jim Williams, or JWJ Incorporated. We started out developing the first zero lot line communities in the city, which Caruth Home Place was one, Briarwood, Tealwood, on remnant piece of, so it was like infill development experiments. Find a remnant piece of property and build a very relatively high density but extremely high end residential product for people that want to have a big house, place for their art and stuff, but don't want the $500 a month water bill for their lawn. They want to still be in Highland Park, or they want to be in their community of association. So we were meeting a need of an aging population, and I got a chance then to learn about, because my job was design and development. There was sales, finance, design and development, pretty much in construction. So I got to sort of find the property, entitle the property, and then do the plan and get the land development component developed. So again, a vertical learning curve for about the first year and a half. But it was a good experience, and it gave me a chance to see, because I'd always been in the public sector, to be totally on the private side looking at the public sector, which is a perspective that I now very much cherish. And so I remember having been in the public sector, dealing with people wanting to do zoning cases and trying to negotiate one aspect of their PD or another, now being the person seeking zoning, being a chair. I remember coming back to because we had our own construction company, so we built the homes that we did. And so I'm looking down the row and I see us running out of lot supply, and the guy says, will we have lots to go to in a month? I said, well, I don't really know at this moment. So it was an interesting experience.
Okay. And how long did you stay with that development group?
I was there up until the big financial shakeout of the mid-'80s.
Okay.
And the case for me is we had before 85 or 84, 85, we had aggressively bought a lot of real estate. We bought the property north of North Park. We had the property south of South Park on the old Caruth Home Place property. Bought the property north of North Park, fronting 75, part of the old Glen Lakes Golf Course, for commercial development, which it is today. But back then, the residents of North Dallas did not want it to be commercial development. And we had a very long and very expensive zoning case. But in the course of that, I realized that you have in hiring consultants, what I was missing was a consultant that understood the public, the private, the policy, and the physical. And I realized that there were a lot of people in that boat. So after the shakeout of 85, I started my own company, and as an architecture, planning, and development services firm, and did most of the zoning for North Dallas in the mid-'80s and early '90s that took place. A lot of big projects, everything north of Alpha Road, almost up to Verde Valley, east of Dallas Parkway, was something that I dealt with as one big plan. So I got to do big physical plans with multiple owners and sort of bring all this stuff to bear. And I did that until the mid-'90s, when we joined forces with Mesa And then we had an office in Madrid, and we had an office in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and a lot of business. And we broadened our perspective. Continue to do a lot of public plans, do comp plans for cities, but now I could bring to the comp plan an understanding of how the city is going to develop and grow. What are your challenges for the future? I mean, and rather than do a template plan based on an image-driven notion of lifestyle or a formulaic response, like let's do certain kind of nodal villages here, there, and there, could do a clinical analysis of their problems and do a plan that was specifically tailored to where they're going.
You've done lots of comp plans over the years. Is there one that you're particularly proud of?
I think I've done a lot of comp, specifically within the Texas Urban Triangle. So that's Austin, Dallas, Houston, and Brownsville, which you tail dips down into the valley, where growth, cities in the pathway of really high velocity growth, seeking to benefit from all the economic potential that growth offers them without losing their heart and soul to it. Without, as I just finished the plan for Westlake 2 weeks ago, and the mayor says, we're not anybody's suburb, mayor of Westlake. And that's kind of the idea, you know, you don't have to be somebody's suburb. You don't have to be inorganically assumed by an expanding metroplex. Yet you can be a part of that in an organic way and preserve your place, and thereby actually maximize your value potential of that growth, because expansion-driven growth tends to follow corridors alone. Corridors become strips, and all strips over time deteriorate. So you have certain cities in Dallas that are on the periphery of that, where in the 70s they were at the crossroads, and now better development has leapfrogged them and jumped out beyond, because the spatial constraints of shallow, narrow lot strip development for a template that was appropriate at one point in time is no longer appropriate. And so there's this burden of a past that was allowed to just be caught up in growth, rather than directing that growth toward an outcome that would be more sustainable. So, but having been in the development business, understanding how that thinking that goes into how I capture investment and what a city can do to facilitate the capture, which I think is something the city needs to do. But if I facilitate it, then I want something out of it that benefits us in the long term, and will also benefit you, because it will not be a temporal sort of Home Depot here today or Walmart here today and then empty tomorrow as I go down the road. And so that became our product. Our product was this sort of highly economically centered analytical approach to a plan. I say we just finished a plan for Westlake, Texas, in which the entitlements in place for that city are around 25 million square feet. The city only has a population of 1,030. Okay, so as you could imagine, the sort of potential energy that lies in the face of a community whose median home value is 1.8 million today. Okay, so that's a very sophisticated planning problem. It required bringing in all the property owners with all their entitlements to work out solutions that protect submarkets and allow the return to those that have the entitlements. And we came away with almost a 400-page plan for the city, but to get there, it took a lot of that. And so I'm very proud of that, but that has become now the focus of everything I'm doing. I think that I see this as because Texas is not going to stop growing anytime soon. And this problem is becoming more and more prolific, and more cities are scratching their heads and feeling the bite of a, what I call a pass-through phase of economic energy that's not caught within their city limits in a way that is enduring.
So several years ago, your affiliation with Mesa Design went to Mesa Planning. Is that a...
Well, the planning component of Mesa being a much bigger company, I mean, at the height, we had about 108 people prior to 2008 with international offices, and we're doing planning all around the world, actually, in China and India and Africa, Egypt. But after 2008, because the world changed, Mesa was the dominant retail. We worked for Simon, General Growth. General Growth went bankrupt. A lot of our client base fell. In 2008, we dominated the residential market. That kind of pulled back. The Arab Spring changed one's ability to manage the Mideast very well, and a project would be on one day and off the next, never to come back. Or it might come back, and if it came back, we don't know who was on it. So it became a very difficult market to maneuver. So through a series of that, Mesa pulled in as I grew older. So now I'll be 68 in May. So I said, what I'd like to do in the best of all worlds is hunker down on the planning component, and maybe I'm not the best candidate for, ginning back up to a big company with returning markets. Maybe this is my moment to sort of kind of step off. And so we have Mesa Planning and Mesa have this relationship that we maintain, but allows me to serve these sort of urban triangle clients without having to be pulled into larger projects that Mesa itself is doing. I get to do an age-appropriate level of activity. That's like without being turned out into pasture.
Well, let's go back and talk about APA and its predecessors. When did you first get involved in AI? I assume it was AIP that you first got involved with?
Yeah, AIP and CPAT back in those days,
Okay.
I was a very young planner with the city of Dallas, and when they offered the AICP test, I was one of the first people to take it, and I guess I could still pass it today. Probably a much harder test today. I don't know. Back then it was kind of hard. I'm not going to downplay it, but it was one of the first. So, but I've always wanted to sort of participate in the association, help contribute to its relevance. And the first thing I did when I left the city, I was on the city landmark commission for 6 years, and on the city's landmark task forces and urban design. I remained involved in the city of Dallas through the advocacy groups that we had set up under urban design. But the way we set up the landmark commission was, or back then it was a committee, not a commission. It has since become a commission. But it was a committee so that the planners, architects, engineers, real estate people, and other professionals in the citizenry could be involved without creating a conflict of interest for doing business with the city. And so we could have the best of the professional community. And so I was APA's guy on the Landmark Commission for a long time, and could argue the planning position on preservation, which is my passion, because the tendency of preservation is always to run after an architectural icon, or to create design guidelines that are stylistic in nature. Somehow it's got to be Georgian. What is Georgian? Well, Georgian are these 5 things. In truth, in residential architecture specifically, but in American architecture, pretty much, everything is a revival. There is no clarity to style. And a clever architect can argue circles around anyone else on style, it being whatever. You could take something that looks Georgian and tell you that it is, picturesque Tudor, if he had the way you did. And so I saw that as a very shaky ground, but I know that is the tendency of preservation movements, to sort of fall back on what they believe to be a solid body of theory, which is actually quicksand. And as soon as you get involved into conflict where your justification is style and there's a clever architect or attorney, then the capricious nature of that determination is exposed, and your program gets whacked by case law that makes it impossible for you to function. So we always wrote guidelines based on more defensible measurements. For example, in Swiss Avenue, the quality of the block in terms of height-width ratio is the quality to be perpetuated. So there's an average quality relationship that is, so these things became defensible. And I thought that my role in the preservation landmark committee was to sort of keep people mindful of that, and keep the planning thereby keep preservation aimed at its planning effect. We couldn't have the East Dallas Renaissance without planning. But if we get infatuated with monumentation and we start trying to protect single buildings and not think of fabric and not think of district and not think of interconnectivity to a changing urban landscape, that voice needs to be in there. So that was why I wanted to be the APA's representative, and I tried to sort of then make the APA a recognizable presence in that kind of thinking. And that was back then. And then later on I finally rotated off of that after about 6 or 8 years.
But you're a frequent speaker at conferences?
I've spoken at every annual conference for 12, 13, 15 years. And I didn't do it last year because I think I want to slow down. But and I always tried to have a message, and I tried to do something that the talks have been fairly well attended. The last one I gave in the Chicago conference, I brought Wei Ming and the head of Landmarks Illinois to talk about, again, preservation, broader view of preservation. But we had people standing out in the hallways. But the idea is, just like architects and preservationists do with preservation, the planning profession also does. We get caught up in one direction or another. I mean, there was a day when sprawl was the American dream, We had City Beautiful models that had places for sprawl, and then sprawl became the enemy, So I'm not saying that sprawl is good, but I'm using that as an example to point to the temporal nature of the way we view things. And so I consider it to be sort of maybe an assist to our profession to sort of open the window from time to time to let some fresh air in on a current thought. So I have given talks on new urbanism, and I've given talks on other things, transit-oriented development, other things, to sort of let people know that all models need to negotiate with other factors. As the experience in my project at MIT taught me, that there are larger determinants other than image in play, to which we as a human species living in a landscape built or natural or a combination of both are destined to respond to. And somehow, if we deny that expression, we deny the things, I think, that make human settlement what it is. It can't be I mean, the utopian experiments of the 19th century told us that the one-size-fits-all, the sort of closed system solution, do not endure. And so, as I get older, I kind of take on this hat of maybe if I could just be slightly provocative and just sort of get some other dialogues going, that our profession will benefit at the end of the day.
Well, looking back over your career, are there any mentors that kind of
yes,
guided you during your career?
So Ed Romanick, who I mentioned, certainly Wei Ming. I mean, he and I are still very close friends. We communicate a lot. But all these people that I work for. So from Wei Ming, I learned so much about, that whole, to sort of, his genius is the sort of the ability to move it forward. I have a lot of ideas, obviously, but a lot of people have a lot of ideas. Ideas are to some extent cheap, okay? But the ability to sort of recognize an idea and move it forward was Wei Ming's his great genius. And so I learned a lot about how to move it forward, and the lessons I learned with him I've tried to employ. From Jim Williams, the guy I did the development with, again, these are all very visionary people. He had this sort of knack of sort of inspiring people to, we were in a situation where I guess we could have made more money having done some conventional development. But he saw that I don't want to be that kind of person. I want to be a builder of communities, in the Carl's Gables, Florida sense. I want to be a builder of communities. And so, while ambitious and maybe somewhat prideful, it is that quality that makes a difference. And so, his ability, again, to move that idea forward, to actually bring to a community, not just build a clever plan with common wall houses on streets that are pedestrian in nature and that sort of thing, and all these principles of new urbanism that we actually employed back then as pragmatic principles of pedestrianized environments. What animated that idea was the community that was brought together. So Jim could draw people, and we had very interesting people named, famous people in Dallas, other people. So the community became not only became associated with personalities that were of stature in the community, and that just sort of lifted everything up as a grander success than it would otherwise have been. And so I learned from him the importance of moving slow, and it's all about these underpinnings. The idea sort of floats on this froth of stuff that sustains it. Without that, it just quickly drops out of sight. And I've been fortunate to have those kind of people to intersect with, and given the opportunity to have ideas.
Well, the flip side of that question is, do you have any proteges that you're particularly proud of, people that you have mentored?
Well, I have a number of people that have started their own firms along the way, and right now I'm working with a young lady, a planner, who I see as someone, because I'm thinking, okay, in slightly less than 2 years I'll be 70. What do I want to do when I'm 70? And I have 2 grandchildren. I certainly want to see them more. I'm beginning to have those kind of thoughts that come with age and looking at but there's a tremendous body of work, and so I'm fortunate that Ashley, who had worked for me in the past at Mesa, is now someone that I brought in to Mesa Planning, and upon whom I will likely build the future of that, and have set myself some specific targets of places that both of us need to be at certain points in time. There are a number of architects out there that when my company did architecture, before we got 100% planning, we were sort of 50% architecture, 50% planning, who now have their own architecture firms. And I'm doing a development project in Brownsville, Texas. I've done a lot of plans for Brownsville, Texas, the comp plan, the port plan, the downtown plan, other plans. And we ended up having a piece of property that after that I saw was, what Brownsville was lacking is someone that believes in the future of Brownsville to invest money. And here was a piece of property that if I was going to invest money, I would certainly invest money in Brownsville here. So I contacted a friend of mine, and they agreed that the property was indeed the property. And I said, this is Brownsville's moment in the sun. It's coming. It's here. And it's all being driven by the fact that we have a lot of spending in this environment by Mexican nationals that dwarfs the amount of spending of the city. And properly brought into context, that can be translated into employment and other things for Brownsville, as well as a grand economic return for private investment. So they picked up the property, and in the course of all that, the border condition of the wall, which comes right through downtown Brownsville, has whacked about $400 million of annual spending that once sustained their downtown area out. And so the downtown area is suffering from the wall. So we hit upon the idea of doing a binational economic development district. My brother is an attorney lobbyist in D.C., very well connected. And I said, hey, you guys would be the people to help us carry this forward, which they did. And we ended up we had 2 proclamations signed. One is a United Brownsville, which is the business community in Brownsville that rose up out of our comp plan effort, and Imagining Matamoros, which is the business group in Matamoros, have signed a joint proclamation committed to economic development. Since then, the elected officials have signed a similar declaration. So now what we're looking for is a project that can be a cross-border economic development project based on employment and industry, that sort of thing, that truly allows the border, perhaps within this zone of economic independence, to be less of a restraint. And what's interesting about NAFTA, if you read NAFTA very closely, there are sections of NAFTA which allow municipalities or local governments to appropriate the benefits of this treaty if they take such measures as are necessary to do that. nobody's done that. Everybody just wants NAFTA to be this sort of federal dialogue, but thanks to my brother's insights, I saw those sections, and sort of binational economic development agreement becomes such a measure, and ordinances that would then come behind it become a measure to allow some of the interchange of labor and other things that NAFTA sanctions to be conducted within a specific area. And you end up now with, in my mind, if this all comes together the way I hope it will, a wonderful solution to a border condition that for the border communities like Brownsville has become tremendously burdensome on their economy. That's not saying anything about the larger politics of immigration or anything, but just the fact that when you have economic interdependency that's truncated by the inability to transit the barrier, then the once shared economy is seriously affected by that. And it's just 2 + 2 = 4 type talk. So how do we overcome that without changing everything? And this sort of binational economic interdependence, it comes at a great time because you have this near sourcing now to Mexico from our attenuated and vulnerable supply chain from China, and the fact that the Chinese parity with U.S. cost of production is going to be the same by 2017. So Mexico has this labor advantage, but now we have this energy advantage, right? So if I'm a 100 megawatt user with 500 employees and I locate my factory in, here's a Rio Grande, located in Matamoros, Mexico, I save $5 million a year in labor. If I locate that same factory on the Brownsville side, I save $16 million a year in energy. So clearly the heavy energy use should be here and heavy labor use should be here. The two are connected in the normal supply production chain connection of inputs to output. And there is the justification for binational economic development for both sides of the border. And because these guys here, without that there, the $8 billion that Matamoros has output, of which is about $6.2 billion of input, only 2% is manufactured regionally. So the industrial leakage is huge, billions and billions of dollars a year. And so I'm trying to bring parties now to the table from the development experience to sort of get involved with these things, because I think now, the time is ripe, and there's all kinds of interest out there for people that want to pick up on this kind of stuff, and so maybe that's our next challenge.
If you had to give any advice to a young planner coming right out of school, what might it be?
Don't be afraid to be in a position for which you're totally underqualified. Just don't say too much about it, but learn what you can, where you can. And I think that we as planners need to not start out with a conclusion as to what is the future should be. I think when you're older, you can have that, and people may hate you for it, which is probably appropriate. When you're younger and you have that, then you close the door to the influence of the present. And I think that's the mistake I see a lot of people make right now. We come out burdened with all this sort of preconception of what the future should be. And again, back in the 50s, we thought that the future should be sprawl. So history does not support that as a position for the young. And so rather than being so tame and fitting into an older person's vision of the future, they need to be more woolly, a little more hairy, and bristle at that, and investigate the validity of that, and only take those parts of it that they understand how to employ. And I think that's what I would say to them. I see a lot of conventionality. I see a lot of archetypical positioning. And I think that's dangerous for us as a profession, because we could sweep ourselves into some sidetrack that ceases to be relevant if we don't do that.
So you have a little bit of a unique background, that you work both in the public sector, but you also worked on the development side. And
yeah.
How important do you think it is for planners to have exposure to that?
I think the public sector employment was, if I was going to say to a planner, every planner should do a stint with the municipal planning agency. I think that that is absolutely necessary to understand politics. Because if you don't, you get in a position where, not understanding it, either trying to placate it or you're adversarial. You don't really understand how it works. At the same token, I think every public planner should have a chance to be on the there is a balance. I think that in the arc of one's career, you know, to be what a planner, in my mind, would aspire to be, which is someone conversant in all the dimensions of how human settlement happens, grows, manifests. Both of those are important. You know, what's interesting is that a lot of what we envision is based on the vertical version of what it is. You know, mixed-use vertical development. It's all about the building. But so much of the underlying value that shapes land use, ultimately. I always tell people, and clients, that development is not like the guy that builds the building, or even the guy that makes the lot on which the building sits. Development starts with the basis owner, and on top of him there's a land investor. On top of him there's a land speculator. On top of him there's a land developer. On top of him there's a vertical developer. On top of him there's an end user. And so this imbrication of interest is the development industry, all working. You drive out I-30 toward Greenville, and you'll see, start out at Greenville, coming in, you'll see Century 21 and Remax. Those are your land investor signs. To get closer, you see Crown, you see Anthony Properties, Texas Real Estate. You know, you see the land assemblers, you see the speculators, and then you get closer, you see project signs from, you know, a particular developer. You can see that dynamic in action, which means that the underlying values of which will be captured by subsequent investment are built by the preceding layer, right? What's interesting is that because so much of what we do as planners is tied to the building permit process, only the peak of that stair step is regulated. And so much of what defines what that will be happens below the surface of planning, because planning has become regulatory, has become sort of focused on regulation. And our comp plan is a chance to think about all these other places, to position value creation through our thoroughfare plan, other plans, in places where value will be created for these guys to capture. And that way the market interest and the public policy interest assume a more close alignment rather than doing this, where the regulation is meant to curtail the market. I actually had a person tell me last night, I was making a presentation to a council, he said, we can suppress if we just don't grant the zoning, then the land will not get to be that valuable. No, that's not going to happen. And what a tragic position for a city to be in, to hold down value appreciation through punitive policy. I mean, is that what planning is about? Or is planning about directing the natural forces of change into a future that is more grand and more wonderful? And so, I forget what the question was to start on that, but clearly we got to view human settlement in more dynamic ways, and we got to get out there.
Well, you mentioned your wife a couple of times. You want to talk a little bit about her career?
Yeah, my wife of 42 years, right? So we met at the city of Dallas. So I thank Wei Ming not only for all that he's taught me, but for bringing my wife and I together. So we were both on the urban design division, and we were left on our honeymoon. Back in those days, there was a show on Channel 13 called Newsroom. You know, Patsy Swank, those guys on there, Billy Porterfield, those guys. So we went to Fort Worth for our honeymoon because we were so crammed with obligations, we couldn't really get away. We went to Fort Worth, and we're in the hotel, and turned on TV, and there was Billy Porterfield and Patsy Swank, those guys talking about Study 10, which is our study of the Turtle Creek corridor. So we watched it, you know. But we have been business partners throughout the duration of our marriage. So we have two wonderful boys. My oldest boy is a doctor and Mass General in Boston, and my youngest boy, my oldest boy, is he's a how to describe him? He's a game entrepreneur in LA, But the company that he went out to be a part of is now like the #1 game in the world. It's Riot Games and League of Legends. It's pretty good. So they're both on their own way. Nobody's going to come back to Dallas now. Everybody's on, so if I want to see them, I'm going to have to be in a position to travel more. So that's what I'm hoping to do, because I definitely want to be a part of my grandchildren's lives.
And neither one of them wanted to be a planner?
No, I guess they saw Dad working too hard, you know. And I thank my wife for that. So they both went through Boy Scouts and stuff. But I mean, I did all the camp outs and weekends, but I've been able to make the scout meetings on weeknights. So Janet, my wife, did all that. So we split that up pretty good.
We talked about your professional career, and we've talked about APA, but are there other organizations that you're active in?
Well, I am. I stayed involved with agriculture. I had and none of my agricultural endeavors have been financially successful. I will, and I'm sure I'm not the first farmer to ever make that claim. But it's been an important lesson, and I've lost my shirt a couple times. But the second time I lost my shirt was I had a dairy farm, a turf farm down near Palestine, Texas. And that was a very formative stage in my boy's life, you know. And so if you remember in the mid-60s, 90s, we had a horrible drought in the mid-90s. We had about 1.5 million yards of turf being watered by a big Zematic irrigation machine. This was a lateral move, not a center pivot. Moved up and down a canal. It took 38 hours to move from one end of the field to the other, like a clock, you know. But it was so dry, and we had lost the subsurface moisture that we went out to cut the turf, and it came up like a broken china plate up the conveyor belt. It just was not there. So I knew that we were done. And so that was that. And so then, so now my third agricultural venture is just simply to have agricultural land. Okay, I'm not going to try and make a living off of it this time. So we have a place out in Commerce, Texas, out in Ladonia, where we live most of the time. And we moved an old barn from Upper New York State, which is 200 years old. Beautiful old building with 10 by 10, 35-foot oak timbers, and moved it down to our property up there. And took 2 years, but it turned into a home. And unfortunately, just when I not get it done, the boys are off, you know. So the idea of the barn with the kids and everything, they still come for Christmas, so we have a grand Christmas out there. But so I missed the timeline for the intersection of the agricultural lifestyle and my children's youth. So now my wife and I enjoy it. My grandchildren get to be a part of it.
We've talked a lot about a lot of things. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about?
I can't imagine anything they haven't talked about.
Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you and appreciate you spending some time with us.
My pleasure.
Okay, thank you.